The year was 1858, and the silence of Bel Rare felt less like peace and more like the stifled breath before a storm. The cane stalk stood 20 feet tall, rustling with a sound like dry bones, concealing everything and revealing nothing in the oppressive Louisiana heat. Every sight, every smell, the scent of wood smoke, the faint perfume of the mistress, the heavy, sweet decay of the river, was a layer in the complex prison Elias inhabited. The sun was an enemy, not a life-giver, bleaching the hope from the sky and intensifying the oppressive humidity that clung to the skin like a shroud. The scent of boiled sugar, the plantation's economic lifeblood, was inescapable, coating the throat and the skin, a constant reminder of the forced labor that sustained the estate. The earth itself seemed to be exhausted, holding the crushing weight of the cane and the silent weight of human misery under a relentless, blinding sky, a silent witness to the daily crimes committed below. The humidity itself seemed to press down on the plantation, turning every physical effort into an act of resistance. Elias moved through the fields with a practiced, almost mechanical grace, his back a map of controlled movement. His movements were so economical, so flawlessly repetitive, that they seemed to blend into the machinery of the plantation itself, eliminating any telltale sign of independent thought. His value lay not just in his immense strength but in his calculated discipline, a quality the overseer mistook for docility, a sign of a spirit subdued and tamed for the master's ledger. The overseer, a coarse man named Silas, had once remarked that Elias was better than any horse, a crude compliment that Elias recorded internally as a precise measure of his successful deception and the degree of his invisibility. Elias knew better. His control was a shield, a rigid mental architecture built to keep the ever-present violence of the system from shattering his inner self. He had perfected the art of occupying space without presence, of performing labor without revealing thought, making himself functionally indispensable but intellectually invisible to his captors, a living ghost of competence. The psychological discipline required to maintain this facade was far more demanding than the physical labor. Every morning before the cock crew, he performed a silent inventory of his body and mind, checking for any lapse, a moment of distraction, a spontaneous sigh, a tremor of fury, and eradicating it with iron will. He subjected his sensory input to constant, brutal filtration. The stench of the slop bucket, the sizzle of fat in the master's kitchen, the distant shouts of Silas, all were reduced to pure, non-emotional data points. He lived in a state of controlled internal distance, allowing only the information vital to his survival and his plan to breach the walls of his emotional armor. He was a man of quiet intelligence, a fact that made him both prized and perilous on the plantation. Master Jules relied on Elias' head for the intricate work, the maintenance of the sugar mill machinery, the precise timing of the irrigation sluices, work that required a mind they assumed was dulled by servitude, yet feared was sharp with awareness, a terrifying contradiction in their ordered world. Jules, a man driven by immediate, visceral profit, understood that the sheer complexity of the modern sugar production, the high-pressure steam engines, the delicate alignment of the centrifugal filters, the long draining trenches, required a technical acumen he himself lacked. Jules's understanding ended where the grease began, forcing him to rely completely on Elias' expertise, a dependency that gnawed at the master's inflated pride. Elias was the only one who could hear the subtle, necessary dysfunctions in the mill's massive engine, the silent tremors that signaled impending breakdown months before any white man noticed a dip in efficiency. He knew the age of the main boiler, the weak points in the iron pressure valves, and the cumulative fatigue in the massive main drive shaft, mapping their internal vulnerabilities like a battlefield where the enemy was material, not human. This awareness was a dangerous secret, a hidden sovereignty over the plantation's economic heart. 3 nights a week, under the deepest cloak of moonless dark, Elias used his knowledge of the mill's shadows and the night watchman's predictable cough to slip away. His body was a precision instrument of movement, navigating the damp, twisting paths without disturbing a single firefly or the sleeping dogs, moving by the unseen geography of memory and sound. He kept a tiny, hidden cache of salvaged paper and charcoal, items that were more valuable and subversive than any weapon. The paper, carefully smoothed and ironed to remove telltale wrinkles, and the charcoal, meticulously sharpened and wrapped in oilskin, represented the forbidden tools of liberation, the power to formalize thought and transmit knowledge beyond the reach of the spoken word, creating an archive of defiance. The oilskin wrapping itself was a critical detail, protecting the charcoal from the aggressive humidity that would otherwise turn the fragile writing medium to mud. This small act of engineering proved his relentless focus on preserving the tools of his quiet war against the environment and the slave codes, every detail a victory over the forces determined to keep them ignorant. In a dilapidated shed near the bayou, a place ignored due to its swarms of mosquitoes and the persistent smell of decay, Elias taught. 5, sometimes 6, others gathered, their eyes hungry in the gloom, absorbing the shapes of letters, the alchemy of words. It was a capital offense, an act of rebellion executed with silent chalk strokes and hushed breaths, the very air in the shed thick with the shared danger and the desperate hope of literacy. His students were the ones Elias deemed most able to endure the psychological strain of forbidden knowledge. The young, quick-witted field hand who could memorize long passages, the quiet laundry woman who moved between the house and the cabins and could carry messages, and the scarred, older man who remembered the narratives of their ancestral homes and anchored their lessons in history, providing context for their fight. Elias taught them that the alphabet was the first key to unlock the mind, allowing them to decipher the master's contracts, the abolitionist pamphlets rumored to cross the state lines, and ultimately, the map to freedom itself. Every lesson was a calculated risk, a direct challenge to the system built on enforced ignorance, a tiny, defiant seed of self-ownership planted in the hostile, poisoned soil of Bel Reve. Madame Aurore, the mistress, was a different kind of tyrant than her husband. Where Jules used the whip and the threat of the block, relying on pain and spectacle, Aurore specialized in slow, psychological corrosion. Her weapon was the control of the internal world, the destruction of moral and mental space, twisting the victim's own intellect against them. She was frail, cloaked in silk, and obsessed with an absolute, suffocating order that mirrored the rigid discipline of the house. She demanded the arrangement of flowers in the grand salon be refreshed precisely every 24 hours, and the dusting of ancestral portraits be perfect to the microsecond, ensuring that no object, living or inanimate, was allowed to exist outside her precise, fragile aesthetic, a desperate attempt to contain the wild nature she feared. Her favorite ritual was the daily review of the estate ledgers, a symbolic act of mastery over the profits generated by bodies she never saw. She often summoned Elias to the library to verify the mill's output figures, placing him deliberately close to her, in the rarefied air of mahogany and leather, a calculated intrusion that blurred the dangerous lines of her power, forcing him to witness her dominion over his productivity and his intrinsic worth. Elias stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the mahogany floorboards, speaking only when addressed, his voice low and precise, clipped to the minimum necessary words. Aurore didn't fear him. She was fascinated by his stillness, by the visible effort of his control, recognizing in him a mirror of her own relentless internal discipline, though employed for opposite ends. She saw his intelligence as a perfect tool, a keen edge she could utilize and in doing so claim dominion over his mind, a prize more coveted than his body or his labor. By possessing his intellect, she felt she possessed a piece of the rebellious genius she saw reflected in the forbidden books on her shelves, vicariously engaging with forbidden power, projecting her own desires onto his controlled existence. Their hidden war began not with a fight, but with a momentary lapse in his self-control, a deviation measured not in seconds, but in milliseconds. It was during the evening meal service, in the echoing silence of the dining room, where the air was heavy with the scent of silver polish and unspoken tension, a stage set for the performance of privilege. Elias was serving water, his gaze fixed meticulously on the rim of the crystal glass. For a fraction of a second, a breath so quick it should have been imperceptible, his eye rose. Not in defiance, not in lust, but in a flash of pure, critical appraisal. He saw not the mistress, seated at the head of the polished mahogany, but the brittle, frightened woman beneath the silk, the one who relied on Aristotle to mask her profound isolation and her fear of the very earth she claimed to own. He saw her as an opponent in a game of chess, one whose weaknesses were now fully exposed. Aurora felt it like a physical blow, a direct penetration of her carefully constructed authority. The sudden, unauthorized presence of Elias the man in the eyes of Elias the property was an act of treason more profound than any whispered plot. It was an assertion of self-sovereignty that threatened the entire edifice of Bel Reve, a declaration of equality that could not be tolerated. The sound of her silver fork scraping sharply across the china was the only outward sign of her rage. She did not raise her voice, but dismissed him with a single, icy word. Go. The next morning, her order was conveyed through the overseer Silas, its severity masked by bureaucratic detachment. 200 lashes for insolence. The cotton gin was chosen because its thick brick walls muffled sound, removing the spectacle of the lashing from the field hands, denying Elias the potential camaraderie of shared suffering. It was a private punishment, calculated to isolate him entirely in his pain, turning his endurance into a solitary burden, a refined cruelty that only Aurora, the intellectual tyrant, could devise. The silence was meant to amplify his internal suffering. Elias walked to the gin house, his discipline unbroken, his mind already separating the pain from the self. The 200 strokes were an eternity, a rhythm of agony that sought to pound the self-possession from his spirit. He focused on the geometry of the roof rafters, the predictable pattern of the light beams, transforming the raw, screaming nerve endings into a mere physical phenomenon external to his core being, a strategy of radical dissociation. He did not cry out. He did not beg. His silence was the final, desperate act of defiance, a refusal to grant Silas the satisfaction of a broken will. His breath came in measured, shuddering gasps, each one a testament to the internal wall he had built between his mind and his body. The very air he breathed was controlled, but the integrity of his focus remained absolute. The pain, once the primary enemy, became a tool. He used the searing agony to etch the lines of the escape map more deeply into his memory, linking each flash of fire with a river bend or a specific star pattern. The lashing was a ritual of fire that purified his resolve, making his plan immune to any future physical threat, a costly investment in his future freedom. When Silas was finished, he left Elias where he lay, a man reduced to raw, bleeding flesh, his strength drained, his endurance a terrifying question mark. But the final, most terrifying part of the order was yet to come, a testament to Aurora's unique cruelty, which sought not to destroy him, but to claim his pain to appropriate his very recovery. The stable hands were instructed to carry him, not to the crude infirmary, which would offer him the solace of shared suffering, but to the master's house, and specifically to the detached conservatory adjacent to Aurora's private study. This was a glass-walled room reserved for rare orchids and quiet, aristocratic contemplation, a place of extreme, controlled light and air, sealed against the disruptive sounds of the plantation. He was placed on a simple, low cot in the center of the conservatory, where the humidity was suffocating and the light was relentless, filtered only by the pale green glass that intensified the heat. It was an environment of maximum visibility, a gilded cage designed for one purpose: to make his suffering an object of continuous, effortless surveillance and intellectual engagement, forcing him to be the centerpiece of her torment. Aurora herself appeared, cloaked in a pale linen dressing gown, her face devoid of emotion. She carried a basket of linen bandages, antiseptic, and a leather-bound copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. She dismissed the servant who had brought the supplies and began the process of cleaning and bandaging his wounds herself, her movements agonizingly slow and deliberate. The physical act of her hands, cold and precise, touching his destroyed flesh, was an invasion far more profound than the whip. It was a deliberate, total blurring of the boundary between master and property, between punishment and false cure. She was asserting ownership over his pain, claiming the role of both executioner and healer in a grotesque performance of dominion, demanding his absolute moral and physical submission. Elias was trapped. He could not move and he could not speak. The pain made coherent thought a jagged effort, but he forced his mind to focus on her actions, her breathing, the subtle scent of lavender and expensive soap that clung to her. He recognized this was not healing. It was an act of sustained psychological degradation designed to annihilate his internal sovereignty, a forced, intimate participation in his own destruction. "You looked at me, Elias," she finally whispered, her voice low, measured, and dangerously calm as she applied a searing antiseptic. "You looked at me not as your mistress, but as a theorem to be proven. That is not property, Elias. That is anarchy. And anarchy will be subsumed into order, starting with your mind." She did not wait for a reply. She began to read, her voice a thin, melodic thread against the oppressive silence of the conservatory. She read passages from Aurelius, focusing on the Stoic principle of accepting fate, of finding virtue in suffering, turning the great philosophical text into a direct instrument of his torment, demanding intellectual complicity in his own bondage. "The external things are not for my control," she read, her finger tracing the text on the page. "But my own mind is. You suffered, Elias. Now you must perform the superior act of enduring it silently, of using your intelligence to justify your presence here." He realized the horror of the situation was absolute. She intended to hold him in this state of agonizing performance, lying wounded, enduring her care, and forcing his mind to engage with texts that mocked his reality, until his discipline finally shattered, revealing the fury and the man beneath the stone. His body was paralyzed, but his mind had to perform. The first night was an eternity of fire, heat, and philosophy. Aurora remained seated in a wicker chair just beside his cot, reading, occasionally lifting her eyes to watch his chest rise and fall. When he drifted toward unconsciousness, she would simply adjust his bandages, a sharp, deliberate touch that brought him instantly back to agonizing awareness, ensuring the surveillance was continuous, a constant reminder of her presence. This sustained intellectual torture was the true purpose of the 200 lashes. The lash prepared his body for the total siege on his mind. His pain was her canvas, and his silence was the performance she demanded. She needed to know that even his endurance was an act of obedience to her will, a final, total psychological victory. Days bled into one another. He lost all track of time, anchored only by the rising and setting of the sun through the pale green glass and the cadence of Aurora's voice. She moved through her library, forcing him to listen to excerpts from Pascal on the futility of human ambition, Seneca on fate, and Machiavelli on the necessity of power, transforming her study into an amphitheater for his agony. She spent an entire afternoon dissecting the social contract, demanding Elia's articulate why, in Rousseau's framework, a man who chooses his chains is more contemptible than the man who is forced into them. She wanted him to argue his own moral failure, using the very language of the Enlightenment he risked his life to teach, forcing him to use his intellect to dismantle his own hope. He was forced to transcribe passages she selected onto small slate tablets, a monumental, excruciating task given the instability of his body and the raw state of his nerves. She demanded that his script remain perfectly neat, arguing that pain was no excuse for a lapse in order. "Disorder is the mark of the defeated mind, Elias," she would purr, watching him struggle to grip the stylus. "Your hand must obey your will, even when your body screams treason." He used every ounce of his remaining discipline to form the perfect, elegant script, his internal fury fueling the precise control of his tremor, transforming the transcription into a coded message of his survival. His strategy shifted from mere endurance to active data acquisition. While his hands transcribed the hypocrisy of philosophical justifications for tyranny, his mind was cataloging the margins of her private library, noticing the subtle difference between her French editions and her English translations, analyzing her intellectual vulnerabilities. He realized the horror of the situation was absolute. She intended to hold him in this state of agonizing performance, lying wounded, enduring her care, and forcing his mind to engage with texts that mocked his reality, until his discipline finally shattered, revealing the fury and the man beneath the stone. His body was paralyzed, but his mind had to perform. The turning point came when she introduced Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, a book she annotated heavily. Her marginalia focused intensely on the sections concerning river commerce and the governance of colonies established near major waterways. This was not philosophy. It was a blueprint for economic survival, a confession of her fear of the environment. She classified the charts meticulously, discussing the various flood control measures being debated by the Louisiana government. Information Jules would never bother with, seeing it as frivolous politics. Aurore saw it as the ultimate form of high-level control, the ability to predict and manage the behavior of the Mississippi itself, to control the environmental chaos that her husband ignored. It was during a feverish debate on Hegel's dialectic that Elias found his true opportunity. Aurore, exhausted by her own obsession, left a specific hand-drawn map lying open on her desk, detailing the precise, weak points of the Bell-Rare-Levy system, a map compiled by her grandfather decades ago. The map, a relic of superior, old-world engineering knowledge, showed the single, unreinforced retaining wall that Jules had refused to maintain due to cost. Aurore was using this map to cross-reference the historical flood data with the current river charts, seeking a flaw in the system to leverage against Jules's recent, reckless expenditures. She was planning her own smaller act of sabotage, a manipulation of the river's flow to pressure her husband financially, unaware that Elias was planning a catastrophe that would eclipse her own petty scheme. Lying on the cot, his eyes dry with fever, Elias memorized the map, ingesting every detail of the vulnerable terrain. He had spent 5 days enduring her torment, 5 days of calculated submission, and his reward was this single, vital piece of knowledge. He had traded physical devastation for absolute strategic superiority. His pain had purchased his freedom. He realized the full scope of his opportunity. The mill sabotage, his long-planned quiet act of financial ruin, was too slow. Aurore's obsession with control had delivered the means for a swift, total diversion. A catastrophic flood, masked as a natural disaster, engineered by a subtle breach at the exact weakness Aurore herself had documented. He used the rhythm of his own throbbing back to anchor the map's coordinates in his mind, linking the points to the stars he memorized near Jeremiah's smokehouse. The physical torment became the scaffolding for his rebellion, transforming the deepest wound into the key to his ultimate triumph. That night, as the humidity reached its peak, Aurore finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping fitfully in the wicker chair, the book of Aurelius still resting in her lap, her hand resting on a particularly dry passage about the inevitability of fate. Elias, using the last reserves of his strength, slowly, agonizingly, rolled off the cot. He moved not like a man in pain, but like a shadow moving through water, navigating the treacherous landscape of the conservatory floor. He did not need to touch the map. He had already ingested it. His escape required a performance of discipline more absolute than any act of obedience. He gathered a small piece of charcoal he had managed to conceal in the cot's stitching, a piece saved from the shed's original stock, and approached the largest, clearest glass panel of the conservatory. In the faint moonlight, he drew a single, clean line on the glass, a line perfectly parallel to the floor, just above Aurore's head. It was not a threat, but a statement of philosophical victory. The line represented the perfect, unbending horizontal plane of the horizon, the symbol of absolute freedom and self-sovereignty, drawn with a stillness that defied the trauma inflicted on his body. It was his final, silent correction to her world of arbitrary control. He then moved out, disappearing into the plantation grounds, his mind already calculating the precise angles, the tide charts, and the flow rates needed to execute the final, colossal act of defiance. The pain was now a guide, an internal clock reminding him of the ticking necessity of speed. He sent the laundry woman, the quietest member of his circle, to Jeremiah in the smokehouse. Her movement was disguised by the early morning rush to the laundry tubs, a scheduled activity that no one questioned. She carried no note, only a memorized sequence of 3 distinct coughs, a cadence Elias had practiced with her until it was flawless. Jeremiah, despite his pain, instantly recognized the signal. He was the hub of their secret network. He then began his own covert communication. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short coughs, a sound that mimicked the persistent, harmless phlegm of an old man, but which signaled the chosen 5 to prepare for movement, communicating the imminent arrival of the storm and the critical window of chaos. The signal was passed silently from person to person, the rhythmic clatter of a cleaning bucket, a specific hitch in a field song, the sudden, rhythmic rocking of a crib, a network of defiance moving faster and more invisibly than any horseman could ride. Elias had weaponized the mundane. He spent the next 36 hours executing the final pieces of his plan. He fortified his own position at the mill, making himself appear frantically devoted to protecting Jules's property, while secretly loosening the final bolts on the old water sluice that would need to be opened during the crisis, a minor adjustment that would save him crucial seconds when the moment came. The heavens broke 2 days later, exactly when Elias had predicted from Auror's stolen charts. The rain came down not in drops, but in sheets, turning the bayou into a churning, angry artery. Jules, drunk and dismissive, scoffed at the warnings, relying on his cheap, compromised levies. Elias, still heavily bandaged but moving with a grim purpose, was ordered by Jules to inspect the mill. He used this official duty as his cover, slipping away under the torrential downpour and the growing panic of the overseers, who were scrambling to protect tools and seed stock. He moved with a supernatural focus, the memory of Auror's voice driving him forward. He reached the weakest point of the levee, the precise coordinate marked on Auror's grandfather's map. Working in the swirling, waist-deep water, his body screaming 1,000 protests, Elias ignored the fire that consumed his back, focusing only on the subtle pressure dynamics of the clay and mud. He used his small, forged tool to make the initial, crucial breach, a tear so small it was invisible to the rushing brown water, but deep enough to penetrate the packed earth of the foundation. Then he stood back, letting the relentless power of the river do the rest of the work silently, violently. The Mississippi, granted its opportunity by Jules's arrogance and Elias' precision, did not hesitate. The small tear widened silently, insidiously, becoming a fast-moving torrent that hollowed out the bank from the inside. Within the hour, the bank collapsed with a colossal, sucking sound, and the river poured over Belle Reve like a tidal wave, rushing toward the cane fields, a massive, muddy, unstoppable force. The chaos was instantaneous and absolute. The carefully ordered world of the plantation was swept away by a wall of brown, churning water. Jules staggered out of the house, shouting, his face a mask of disbelief and ruin, watching his entire harvest disappear under the flood. His shouts were lost in the roar of the water. Elias was the only one who remained calm. He positioned himself by the mill, performing the motions of salvage, shouting commands to the frantic overseers, commands that were useless, but necessary to maintain his facade as the indispensable engineer. He was the only one with the knowledge and the discipline to survive the chaos. He watched the water consume the cane, tear through the sheds, and wash away the soil. The water was not just destroying property. It was washing away the tracks of 5 people, sweeping their scent, their traces, and their existence into the boundless, untraceable expanse of the bayou, erasing the very evidence of their defiance. The 5 escaping students, guided by the signal and the compass points Elias had drilled into their memories, moved through the chaotic night with synchronized purpose. They moved in silence, using the roar of the flood to mask their footsteps, following the subtle markings on the oak trees, their fear overcome by the intoxicating power of their liberation. Aurora stood on the porch, her silk gown ruined by the muddy spray, watching the destruction with a look of terrified, impotent fury. She saw Elias standing by the mill, an island of stillness in the surging chaos, and finally she understood the true nature of the look she had seen in his eyes days before. It was not defiance, but the calm certainty of a man who held the secret of her fate. She realized the irony, the ultimate sickening joke. The knowledge she had forced him to acquire, the maps, the philosophy, the engineering of chaos, was the precise tool he had used to destroy her. Her intellectual tyranny had inadvertently armed her prisoner with the keys to her kingdom. The climax was not the flood itself, but the moment Aurora realized that the catastrophe was not God's will, but the quiet, calculated vengeance of the mind she thought she had mastered. The collapse of the levee was the physical expression of the intellectual freedom she had tried, and failed, to extinguish. The floodwaters receded slowly, leaving behind a landscape of ruin, mud, and financial devastation that would consume Jules and Aurora for years. 5 people were gone, their disappearance a footnote in the catastrophe, assumed to have been swept away by the river's merciless tide. The ledger remained in Aurora's library, but the true wealth, the minds and lives of the students, was lost forever. Elias remained. He became the architect of the reconstruction, the indispensable brain that alone held the knowledge of the mill's inner workings and the layout of the damaged fields. He had destroyed the plantation to save his students, and now he owned the knowledge required to resurrect it, but only on his terms, ensuring his safety until the next 5 could be guided to freedom. He was the last man standing in the wreckage of Bel Reve, his back scarred, his mind perfectly free, bound only by his commitment to his hidden purpose. The physical act of survival, the meticulous reconstruction, was his final act of discipline, ensuring his security until the next opportunity, the next wave of students, the next planned catastrophe. He looked at the surviving portion of the conservatory glass, the faint, nearly invisible line he had drawn. It was still there, the horizontal plane of self-sovereignty, a silent moral truth etched into the heart of the prison. The system had tried to own his pain, but he had used that pain to buy the freedom of others. The moral, the most disciplined mind in the house is the one that chooses what to obey. The quote, "They sought to break the man, but they only forged the strategist."